Okay. Reconstruction of the period from 65 to 77 when the federal government carried out the process of trying to rebuild the southern states, bring them back into the Union, and put in place some type of system of government and society that could be functional in the South. And of course, one of the big issues is how are the 4 million freedmen now going to interact with the white population in the South. So as we go through Reconstruction, we're going to look at basically 3 periods. Presidential Reconstruction, which occurs from about 65 to 67. Then Congressional Reconstruction from 66 to the end, but then the latter part of the Reconstruction period, 74 to 77 or so, you have a lot of chaotic political maneuvering taking place between the Republicans and the Democrats. As I mentioned, the big issue is how are the newly freed slaves, you can't be a free slave, but how are the freedmen going to interact in Southern society? What is that going to be? Because of course Southern society had been so heavily ingrained in the separation of the races under the slave system. So how do you break down those barriers and bring those freedmen into a functional part of society? And then of course Reconstruction is also very, very political in that the Republican Party had dominated during the Civil War, largely due to the fact that there was a divided Democratic Party, the Democratic Party with its heavy base in the South. And then, how are they going to mesh once the Democrats are brought back into the Union? Okay, one of the fun things you get to do in history is the what ifs. And one of the questions with Reconstruction is, what if Abraham Lincoln lives? Would it have been different? Most people believe it would. But the reality is probably more along the lines of the challenges of Reconstruction may have even been bigger than Abraham Lincoln. And could he have altered the direction of Reconstruction? Probably not. Okay, simply because, again, the issues that were being faced in this period were far beyond the means of any one individual. Would it have been different with Lincoln? In a sense, yes, because Lincoln did mandate or demand the respect that any other leader at that time did not. So, would there have been the struggles? Maybe not. Nevertheless, we'll never know. Of course, Lincoln is killed. We kind of talked about that before. And what's interesting is Southerners, at the time of his death, of course, they're all cheering the death of Abraham Lincoln, but very soon they figure out that probably wasn't the best thing for them. Because Abraham Lincoln quite possibly would have been able to push back a lot of the radical Republican ideas that were very harsh towards the South. And one of the things Lincoln was very known for saying is that he wanted a quick reconciliation. He wanted to bring the Southern states back into the Union, and he wanted those Southerners to have a say in Reconstruction and be a part of that decision-making process. All right, what are the challenges? Obviously, the South is in disarray, economically, politically, socially. Things have really been flipped upside down. The question of how do you bring those states back into the Union, and the question is, as Lincoln viewed it, there was no question, because the Southern states had never legally left. They'd always remained part of the United States of America. So, do they need to go through the process of asking for readmission to the Union? In Lincoln's eyes, not so much. Okay, they'd never left. Who's going to direct it? Who's going to be responsible for implementing the process of rebuilding the South? Are we going to leave it up to the South? Is the president going to guide it with his beliefs, or is Congress going to carry out their direction, or a mixture of those? We talked about how the freedmen would be dealt with. And then one last question is, how do you deal with the Confederates? Because under the Constitution, I believe there's only one criminal action identified in the Constitution that is punishable by death. And that's treason. And treason, of course, is an act against your country, an attempt to try and overthrow or disrupt the direction of your nation and your nation's government. So, is that what the Confederates had done? Had they committed treason under the U.S. Constitution? And if so what do you do then? Round up all these former Confederates and have a mass execution in the public square? Probably not. Okay? That's not the way definitely Lincoln would have done it. So, what do you do with them? Do you allow them to become governors of their states? Do you allow them to become mayors in their towns? Do you allow them to become policemen and judges and lawyers in their communities? Or do you totally restrict them? How do you prevent that ideology of slavery and Confederacy from spreading again? Okay? It's kind of the same problem that the Western Allies had following World War II in Germany. Is how do you rebuild Germany and put in an effective leadership government when the majority of the people who have worked in the government are former Nazis? Same thing in the South. The majority of the people who work in government are former Confederates. So, a lot of stuff going on. What had happened in the South? Well, as Margaret Mitchell titled her book about the Civil War and Reconstruction period, it was gone with the wind. Blown away. It did not exist. Okay? The basis of Southern society, as it had developed over time, had become the economic element of cotton, plantations, and the separation of blacks and whites based upon slavery. The clear identification of superior and inferior. Now that's gone. That base element has been eliminated through the 13th Amendment. Most cities have been devastated, and while the fighting, of course, the weaponry of the Civil War is nowhere near what it is today. Still, the destruction in these cities where some heavy fighting took place was paramount, and they had to be rebuilt. Inflation had destroyed the economic activity of many small businesses. They were without the ability to carry on. The transportation system was destroyed, primarily the railroad system, which during Sherman's march to the sea and his marches throughout the South, as other armies of the Union carried out as well, as they ripped up the railroad tracks, heated up the rails, and tied them into little bow ties, just basically bent them in half so that they could never be used again. That had to be reestablished. The life of the planter, okay, the symbolism. If you ever get a chance, you can Google Southern plantations and get some of the imageries of Southern plantation life. It was an elite society, and it was a society that they had created and that they had protected by preventing the masses, the underclass, from participating in government and in the political process. But now that was gone. Okay, the reality had set in that you could have a group of people who were coming in that were going to prevent you from carrying on that type of political system. They were now equals. They were on the same level of the majority of all Southerners. And that was difficult, of course, for them to deal with. And then, of course, their wealth had been gone, had been stripped from them, whether it was their land, but definitely their slaves. Many Southerners remained very defiant. Okay? And here's a popular song from the time period. I'm not going to sing it for you. You You can buy it. You can buy it on iTunes though. Boyd actually's got a pretty good version of it. But as you can see in the lyrics here, the attitude of many Southerners remained one of honor. They were proud of what they had done. They were proud of the fight that they fought. And of course, very quickly after the war, the ideology of the lost cause, that this was a war that was fought. They knew they probably weren't going to win it, but they fought it anyway, simply because they believed it was the right thing to do. And fighting it and losing it was more honorable than never fighting it at all. And they wanted no part of being part of the United States again. And that even, continues to today. A lot of, when you go to many southern cities, you see monuments to Confederate soldiers. As we do in northern cities, you go down to the park, you have the monument to the Civil War soldiers. In southern cities, there's monuments to the Civil War soldiers as well, but Confederate soldiers. There's statues of Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis all throughout the South. Those are their heroes, which brings the question as well, is it right to build monuments to people who have committed treason and allow them to exist? And the other day, when I was harvesting, I was listening to NPR, and they were talking about how at the University of Mississippi, the university is attempting to remove some of the symbolisms of the Confederacy. They have a Confederate drive that runs down through the campus of the University of Mississippi. They want to get rid of that, rename it. Okay? It wasn't that long ago, if you watched the University of Mississippi football game or sporting event, especially football games, they were waving the Confederate flag. Okay? And then they said, no, you can't do that anymore. And was it a symbolism of the Confederacy? For some, maybe, but for many, it was just a symbolism of the University of Mississippi. And they are entrenched in Civil War history. But the university is trying to get rid of those, and when they were on the radio, when they were talking to the alumni, the alumni were pretty upset. That's not what the University of Mississippi is about. Okay, it's the traditions, and having Confederate drive, and having the rebel as your mascot. Those are the traditions of the University of Mississippi, and shouldn't be changed. And some people will look at it as, are they proud of what they've done? And in most instances, they probably say absolutely. Even to this day. What do you do with the freedom? What were their options? They get 4 million of them. Some people say ship back to Africa. What's the problem with that? None of those 4 million people have probably ever been to Africa. They weren't. Well, that was before the colonization. Yeah, they did have colonization societies. Liberia, in the area of Sierra Leone, we got Ebola and Granite right now. Liberia was a slave colony where they started to ship people from the slavery in the West back to Africa. But for these 4 million, you got to remember, 1808, the slave trade from Africa was legally ended. So the number of slaves coming directly from Africa had dwindled. And the vast majority of the slaves who were in the United States had been born in the United States. So the idea of sending them back would be like saying to the German Americans around Sutton, we're going to ship you back to Germany. Never been there. That's where you came from. Okay. Could they go north and live in the cities? Probably not, because they weren't really welcome there either. So one of their options was to take advantage of a piece of legislation passed during the Civil War in the absence of the Democrats, and that's the Homestead Act. Move west and settle on the prairie where there's fewer white people. Okay, and you could escape maybe some of the hardships of living in the established societies of the East, and that's what some do. They were called exodusters. They established one of them established a black community in Nicodemus, Kansas. It's about 2 hours southwest of here. And carried on. The Freedmen's Bureau was an organization that began during the war as the Army moved south and began to capture, I wouldn't say capture, but began to be overwhelmed with slaves coming to the Army to be set free. What do you do with these people? So very quickly, people look at the opportunity to go to the South to help educate these freedmen, and it's a very successful program, very, very useful. And I know you're all familiar with the KKK. Okay? It was an organization. One of the reasons that Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former Confederate, started it is because they were upset with the progress made by the Freedmen's Bureau, and they wanted to create this organization to put pressure on people who were coming from the north to the south to work in the Freedmen's Bureau. School teachers and people like that. They would violently attack them, more than likely just intimidate them. Sometimes there was probably a death, but it's not like you see on TV a lot of times where widespread hangings all over the place. It existed, absolutely, but the intimidation was there to try and discourage people from coming south to help out the blacks. And why would they want that to happen? Obviously, because they don't want the black population to have the access to the education that, for many Southern whites, they didn't have. Okay. It expires in 1872, primarily for political challenges. All right, the guy who replaced Lincoln is Andrew Johnson. He had been chosen in 1864 for vice president because he was a Southerner. And Lincoln believed that having a Southerner as vice president would soothe a little bit the transition of Reconstruction. The problem was Andrew Johnson isn't nearly able to be president of the United States. And when Lincoln is dead, he takes over, and imagine that, walking into the White House after Abraham Lincoln's been shot, and you're the guy that's got to pick up where he left off. A little bit of a challenge there. And there's no way he could do it. And he quickly, he doesn't have the reputation that Lincoln had. So as Congress begins to deal with Johnson, they do so very, very forcefully. Lincoln was well respected. Lincoln had a high public popularity. So, the radical Republicans in Congress are going to be a little more hesitant to take on Lincoln. Johnson, they're not. Okay, the first part of Reconstruction is the presidential Reconstruction. That takes place even before the war ends. Lincoln's in the process of kind of outlining what he wants to do. Of course, as they occupied states like Arkansas and Louisiana, the process of Reconstruction began there almost immediately upon those occupations. And he's very lenient, just like the movie we watch, where he tells Grant, let them, we want a smooth reconciliation. We don't want this to be a retribution, an attacks against the Southerners. So the 10% plan is kind of the basis of it, with 10% of the population needing to be recognized as a state. So if 10% of the population says, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. So if they pledge an oath to the nation, then they will be brought back in. Okay? The Wade-Davis bill, in very simple terms, is an attempt by the Republicans, and again you see the attitudes of the radical Republicans here, is they fear that if you're too lenient on the South, what you're simply going to have, as I mentioned earlier, is former Confederates re-emerging as political leaders of the South, and over time, just a legal reestablishment of the Old South. And to prevent that, they passed the Wade-Davis bill, which would, in very simple terms, deny those individuals the ability to fulfill those public positions. So over time, we see this emerging dispute between Congress and the President that will carry out and be a hallmark of the Reconstruction period. The division, or the hostilities between the Congress and the President lead to a division in the Republican Party. You have those with the president, tend to be the moderates or the very conservatives, and then you have the radicals who want the Thaddeus Stevens way. As again, you saw in the movie, we want retribution, we want to punish the South, we want to flip their world upside down and let them know who's in charge now. Okay, that's what Thaddeus Stevens wrote. And that, likewise, the hostility between the Republicans will become one of the major features of the period. Johnson goes with Lincoln. Sorry, I spelled succession wrong. It's secession, S-E-C. But it's probably autocorrect. I'll blame it on the computer. He repeals the Act of Secession. He basically takes the position as Lincoln that there was no legal separation. He asked that they ratify the 13th Amendment, a formal abolition of slavery. Does anybody know? A little trivia here. Anybody know which state, southern state, former Confederate state, was the last to ratify the 13th Amendment?
Mississippi.
Mississippi. And we know what year? Between 1865 and 2014.
1992.
Close.
1865.
1996. 1996 was one of their attempts to ratify it. The final approval, I believe, took place in 2012 or 13. And again, it's not that they didn't support slavery. It's just they just had somewhat overlooked it, and when they voted on it, the final process wasn't there. Okay. Then what do you do with the ex-Confederates? He pardons a lot of them. He pardons everybody that comes to him and asks him for that forgiveness. He will carry out that part, which of course puts him at odds with the radical Republicans. I'll come back to the black coats. Okay, now we move on to congressional Reconstruction. And as I mentioned, the Congress basically wanted to punish the South. So, they begin the process of trying to push through legislation to challenge the president's Reconstruction. They want to pass law, they want the president to sign it, they want to direct the election process. And for all the reasons that I've kind of already mentioned. Nevertheless, Johnson still is in control, and on December 6, 1865, he says the Union is restored. All the states are back into the Union. Okay? Things will take a turn. That legislation that Congress begins to pass, they pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866. They wanted to pass laws to make sure that Congress, or that the blacks had the right to vote, that blacks are granted citizenship, that blacks are guaranteed to have equal rights within these southern societies. Okay, they wanted to put that in place. They wanted to do it formally in the Constitution. Okay, sometimes you think about why did they need to pass a constitutional amendment to ban slavery? If it's not in the Constitution, then Congress can quickly and easily vote it out. Does that make sense? If it's in the Constitution, the only way you can change the Constitution is to add another amendment, to repeal that amendment. So it's very, very difficult to eliminate that. So they abolish slavery, then they want to grant citizenship. An important clause of the 14th Amendment is equal protection, guaranteeing that just because you're a citizen, you also are guaranteed equal opportunities, or should be guaranteed equal opportunities. And then the 15th Amendment is granting the right to vote. Okay? And if you remember from the movie, when Thaddeus Stevens' housekeeper was reading the document, there was 2 articles. First article was abolishing slavery. The second article was the enforcement clause. Something new that they did with the 13th Amendment was put in place an enforcement, giving Congress the authority to pass laws to make sure this stuff is carried out. That was with the intention that during Reconstruction, if the South was not doing what they're supposed to be doing, Congress could pass laws to force them to do so. Okay? Nevertheless, They pass the Civil Rights Bill as a quick fix. Johnson vetoes it, they override that veto. They pass the 14th Amendment. Johnson says, no, I don't want that either. And again, it's not that Johnson doesn't want these actions. He just wants the South to have a say. So he wants the South to elect officials, bring them to Washington, and let the Southern states be a part of that debate, rather than just forcing it upon them. Okay, 1866, congressional election of the time period. Johnson hopes to secure seats from the moderates, so he goes out and campaigns for those congressional members. It fails miserably because in his campaign speeches he is very, very personal in attacking guys like Thaddeus Stevens, does not use very choice language, and the American people for the first time get an image of their president, and it's not a very good one. So they vote the other way. The result of that election is now the radical Republicans have a clear majority in both houses of Congress. They can do pretty much what they want, and the president cannot stop them. And that marks the separation from presidential to congressional Reconstruction. Okay? And as I said, they want to really, really hammer the South. So, everything they've done up to this point is washed away. Okay? The restoring of the Union, as Johnson did, the 10% plan, all that stuff, they wipe it away. Congress says we're going to redo it. They establish military districts. They bring the Army back into the South. They strip those states of their government, and they start all over. And they say we're going to do it with the premises of equality among blacks and whites. Okay. It doesn't work out so well, obviously. Because, again, you're forcing these people in the South to carry on and separate themselves from their traditions. As long as the Army was there, the Southerners abided by the guidelines. Once the Army leaves, they ignore it. Okay? It's kind of like me standing behind Garrett, watching him type on his computer. He's doing everything he's supposed to do. Then I walk away and turn, flip the screen, goes and do something else, right? Okay? Very simple. As long as you're there, you're being watched, you're going to do what you're supposed to do. Once you leave, you're going to go back to what you want to. Corruption is widespread. Millions of dollars are going into the South to rebuild it. And you have Northerners who are called carpetbaggers. They're coming into the South to make money. And all of that money is being funneled into these organizations, private industries. And over time, okay, my construction company, I want the government contract, so I go to Tanner and I say, hey, Congressman Tanner, I need this government contract. Okay, you give me $20,000 on the government contract, I'll kick back 5 of it to you. Tanner makes sure things are going my way, and he's getting his end of it. Okay, a lot of that has taken place, which really, over time, as these become public, the American public becomes very hostile towards Reconstruction, and it loses a lot of support. Johnson is impeached in 1867. Congress, after he wins the election, establishes the Tenure in Office Act because they feared that Johnson would begin firing President Lincoln's appointees. Okay, guys that tended to be more favorable towards the radical Republicans. So that Tenure in Office Act prevented him from firing Lincoln appointees. Okay, Johnson called their bluff. He fires Edwin Stanton as Secretary of War, and Congress impeaches him. The House of Representatives votes. It goes to Senate for the trial, and it is there that finally, in Missouri, and Thomas Hart Benton decides that no, we don't impeach a president simply because we have political differences. Okay, so the impeachment, the removal of office, fails by 1 vote. But nevertheless, Johnson's done. Okay, and he knows that. All right. For the South, Reconstruction is worse than the war. And Southern historians, the war's glory, the South is the horror film. It's just ugly, because it was their worst nightmare. That the Northerners were going to come down and force their will upon them. Overall, historians look at this Reconstruction period as a missed opportunity. that had the federal government done more to try and establish the basis for equality in the South, it might be a little bit different today. Why does that Reconstruction end? Well, it comes down to the Compromise of 1877. And in that presidential election, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes falls short of defeating Samuel Tilden in the popular election, but in the House of Representatives, that is now controlled by the Republicans, in the Electoral College, Samuel Tilden falls short of a majority to win. So it goes to the Republicans in the House, and they have a choice of whether to choose Rutherford B. Hayes or Samuel Tilden. But they couldn't choose Hayes because he hadn't won the popular vote. So when the election committee met, the Republicans essentially asked, what does it take to get Rutherford B. Hayes to be president? The Southern Democrats say, end Reconstruction. Walk away. Turn your back on the South and don't look at what's going on. And the Republicans said, okay. Reconstruction came to an end. The Army left, and the federal government, for basically the next close to 100 years, would ignore what is taking place in the South. What does the South do? On one side of the head, there's black codes. We start to see the rapid implementation of legal restrictions on blacks in the South. The implementation of segregation. Okay? Black schools, white schools. Black water fountains, white water fountains. Okay? A clear separation of the races within Southern society existed. And that would exist until the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, when the Civil Rights Movement emerged. And there's your distance. Questions? I know that's pretty quick. I wanted to get that in before you wrote your essays.